Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome. My name is Seth Beeman. I serve as Executive Director and CEO here at the Frist Art Museum. Thank you very much for joining us tonight to celebrate the opening of Printing the Revolution, the rise and impact of Chicano graphics, 1965 to now. As is our custom at the Frist, I'd like to first offer a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum sits on land the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples, elders, and their ancestors call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them and offer deep gratitude and respect to the land and water that support us. Organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Printing the Revolution offers a powerful look at how Chicano graphic artists forged a remarkable and enduring legacy of politically engaged printmaking rooted in cultural expression and social justice movements. We are thrilled, and I am personally thrilled, to have Dr. E. Carmen Ramos, the Chief Curator and Conservation Officer at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., here with us this evening to share more about the exhibition. Before this current role, Carmen was the acting chief curator and curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where I knew her, and she organized the exhibition while she was there. Before I introduce Carmen, I'd like to remind you, please silence your cell phones. You can do it right now. Thank you. And also locate your nearest emergency exit. It's behind you or this way. And I would also like to begin by thanking our supporters for this exhibition. The exhibition in our presentation is supported in part by the Sandra Shatton Foundation and Ameriprise Financial. The Spanish translation and program sponsor is the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies at Vanderbilt University. Thanks to those of you who are here with us tonight. We are also grateful for the continuing operating support from the Frist Foundation, Metro Arts, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Carmen. At the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Carmen leads the curatorial, conservation, and registrar teams as they serve the nation and beyond through collections development, groundbreaking scholarship, art conservation, and scientific research. We had a few minutes to catch up earlier today, and I got to learn about some really fascinating and creative ways that Carmen and her teams are beginning to expand the collections at the museum and begin to present those to their visitors in really innovative ways. I'm excited to learn more about that. In her previous position as the acting chief curator and curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, she expanded the museum's leading collection of Latinx art with an eye towards challenging the exclusion of Latinx art from U.S. art history and capturing the broad aesthetic and regional range of the field. She curated major exhibitions, including Printing the Revolution, which you can see upstairs, Tamayo, the New York Years, Down These Mean Streets, Community and Place in Urban Photography, and Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art, which traveled to 8 cities across the country and received the 2014 Excellence Award from the Association of Art Museum Curators. Please join me in welcoming Dr. E. Carmen Ramos.
Thank you, Seth, for that warm introduction and welcome. So wonderful to see you. It's great seeing you in another context beyond the Smithsonian. And I also want to thank Mark for inviting me here to speak, and for Megan Rust for her great hospitality and support in getting me here. You all have been really gracious and welcoming. And I also want to thank the artists like Michael Menchaca. He's the only one, the only one from the exhibition who's here. But of course, without them, we would not be here. And it's really a pleasure to be here in Nashville to talk about Printing the Revolution, the rise and impacts of Chicano graphics, 1965 to now, an exhibition that considers how the civil rights era set the foundation for a significant, prolific, and politically engaged graphic arts movement that continues to thrive today, over 5 decades later, among artists of Mexican descent in the United States and their cross-cultural collaborators. This is the fourth and final venue of the exhibition, which first opened in 2020, which seems like many, many, many moons ago, at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where I worked for over 11 years before leaving to become the chief curator, chief curatorial and conservation officer at the National Gallery. And this is one of the reasons why I have two logos on the screen. It's wonderful that the exhibition has traveled to so many different cities as institutions around the country work to embrace Latinx artists and engage Latinx audiences. As the exhibition's tour draws to a close, my talk tonight will give an overview of the exhibition and will end on a bit of a reflective tone, and hopefully we can have more of a discussion in the Q&A about the meaning of this show in a larger sense, because I believe that this exhibition and the process of organizing it models inclusive practices for museums today. As a curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, an eminent and important museum of US art, which is located in the nation's capital, I was always very aware that what took place there had a weight in defining what we mean by American art and who's considered an American artist. During my tenure at SAM, I organized several exhibitions of Latinx art seen on the screen that intentionally sought to value, center, present, and interrogate the work of Latinx artists whose work, despite their important perspectives and achievements, had historically been excluded from what we understand to be American culture and art history. Latinx art, which is a term and phrase that brings visibility to artists who are based and very often born or have very deep historical roots in the United States, who are of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadoran, Dominican descent, as well as artists who have other ties to Latin American countries. These artists are living here and form part of this society and are part of the artistic community of this country. Yet until fairly recently, they've been disregarded and marginalized within larger histories of American art. This is what I saw when I decided to curate an exhibition on printmaking, about printmaking among Mexican-American artists, who launched an influential and important graphic arts movement in the 1960s. This glaring omission is very evident in recent museum exhibitions focused on the explosion of graphic arts that occurred in the United States since the mid-20th century, a period known as the American Print Renaissance. On this slide, I've noted how many Latinx artists are included in these exhibitions. 101 to represent the three shows. So it's crystal clear how underrepresented Latinx artists are in print exhibitions of American art. Organizing this exhibition at SAM and having it tour around the country is a kind of intervention in the field of American art that serves to expose and correct the sidelining of Latinx artists, and particularly Chicano and Chicanx artists from the history of graphic arts in the United States. While for many people, the civil rights era is synonymous with the African American civil rights movement, it's important to know that the African American struggle inspired and helped spawn a wide series of rights-based movements across the United States, championed by Latinx people, Asian Americans, women, LGBTQ communities. For Mexican Americans, the Chicano civil rights movement begins in 1965 when Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, Huerta's National Farm Workers Association, which joined the Filipino farmers' grape strike in Delano, California, to demand better wages and conditions for farm workers. The civil rights era was particularly transformational, or as we argue, revolutionary time for Mexican Americans, when adopting the moniker Chicano reconceived their place on the national stage. To call yourself Chicano, a formerly derogatory term for Mexican Americans, became a cultural and political badge of honor that rejected the goal of melting pot assimilation and questioned the entrenched racist underpinnings of US society. The late journalist Ruben Salazar used iconoclastic references when he classically defined Chicano as, quote, a Mexican-American with a non-Anglo image of himself. Malaquias Montoya's print seen here conveys this ethos. His declarative print announces, I am Chicano in Spanish, which itself signals a defiant stance as well as his target audience, and portrays two brown men with broken shackles, suggesting a break with the past. That this image was used to promote a documentary of the same name reveals how artists were deeply invested in reaching a public to the extent that many works have a practical use value. During this period, many artists turned to printmaking to promote an agenda of defiant cultural affirmation and political change. Working independently and with labor unions, community and student groups, and in collectives and institutions they founded themselves, Chicano artists created visually arresting works that initially catalyzed a Chicano public coming into awareness of itself. Terminology and what you called yourself was important in the civil rights era and remains important today. The organization of our exhibition began during a real debate over language as our society wrestled with how to be inclusive along the lines of gender and sexuality. The term Chicana and later Chicanx are terms that show an effort to bring visibility to women, queer, and non-binary people. So while in the 1960s and 70s, Mexican Americans adopted Chicano, and we wanted to respect the historical accuracy of that term, in an effort to be inclusive, I and the exhibition text and catalog, we use the term Chicanx, which is a gender-neutral and non-binary term. This may be a bit clumsy, but we're balancing our roles as historians and our efforts to implement inclusive practices that welcome and respect all people. Parallel conversations and debates are going on as well in the use of the term Latino, Latina, and Latinx, which is why I also put those words on the screen. Printing the Revolution is a very, very rich show, and my talk today will not do it justice. So my goal really is to highlight some major themes and goals of the exhibition to help you unpack the complexity, artistry, and boundless creativity of the artists in the exhibition, and to show that this creativity comes across in many different ways, from the artist's chosen imagery, to how the prints were created, distributed, and to how the artist absorbed many artistic influences. The works you'll hear about and see in the exhibition show how rights movements continue through today and how artists have deftly used their skills to engage in public debates, build, and dialogue with each other's works. Urgent Images is the first section of the exhibition and starts off at the nucleus of Chicano printmaking, the Chicano civil rights movement, and how Chicanx artists and their cross-cultural collaborators prioritize engaging communities around immediate, pressing social and political concerns. Some of the earliest works in the exhibition reveal the important role of the United Farm Workers, or the UFW, founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, as a catalyst for artistic activism. Chavez is a critical figure in the history of Chicano art. As a patron, instigator, organizer, inspiration, he believed that art could activate reluctant farm workers and garner wide public support. Labor unions have long used graphic media to advance their cause. Chavez undoubtedly learned from this history and his knowledge of 20th century Mexican revolutionary movements like Mexican muralism, and inspired by this past, incorporated artists into the union's activities from the very beginning. He encouraged Luis Valdez to found Teatro Campesino, the innovative theater group incubated within the UFW itself that staged performances on truck beds, dirt roads, picket lines, which were themselves captured in this print. The UFW established their own print shop, El Taller Gráfico, which created and sold calendars, posters, Christmas cards, T-shirts, bumper stickers to promote the union's message and earn income. While these forms of visual culture were seen as effective organizing tools in boycott cities, they also helped circulate imagery that visually linked the Chicano experience to the history and spirit of Mexican reform movements, which historically had strong links to radical contemporary artists. El Taller Gráfico appropriated and recontextualized prints by the Taller Gráfico Popular, or TGP, a renowned 20th century activist print collective from Mexico, and nurtured the talents of Andrew Zermino, whose iconic poster Huelga, or Strike, imbibed the satirical style associated with the TGP. Zermino's political cartoons regularly appeared in El Barriado, the UFW's mouthpiece, and true to the newspaper's name, which can suggest the antics of an unspoken child, they critiqued the hierarchical dynamic between growers and farm workers. Javier Viramontes created his iconic boycott grapes in 1973, the year Chavez initiated a new boycott in response to the Teamsters' intervention in disputes between the UFW and California growers. Viramontes was aware of the Teamsters' violent tactics, which likely informed his imagery of an Aztec warrior squeezing grapes that spew blood instead of juice. Viramontes himself suggested that the union sell his print to support their cause. While the union believed the print's blood symbolism might be off-putting, they agreed to the artist's terms and sold the print via mail order. This example demonstrates how Chicano graphics imagery, its affiliation networks, and distribution all register a sense of political urgency. Another characteristic is the materiality of the prints themselves. This work by an unidentified artist, which promotes a pro-labor boycott Gallo wines message, was printed on recycled computer tractor paper, likely donated by the artist from their college campus, an acknowledged practice at the University of California, Berkeley, starting in the 1960s. And here you see the front and back of the print. Other artists like Esther Hernandez tackled labor and environmental concerns in her iconic print Sun Mad from 1982, which critiques the harmful impact of pesticides on farm workers. Here she reconfigures the cheerful branding of the Sun-Made Raisin Company, seen on the right, into a grim warning. In response to her family's exposure to polluted water and pesticides in California's San Joaquin Valley, Hernandez sought to unpack the wholesome figure of agribusiness, such as the Sun-Made. The skeletal figure draws attention to the dangers and adverse effects of various chemicals listed on the print's lower register. In 2008, she reimagined her print to condemn workplace raids of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. In addition to changing the title to Sun Raid, she outfits her skeletal figure with an ice wrist monitor and a huipil, a traditional indigenous garment that suggests how Native people from the Americas represent a sizable segment of the undocumented. Labor continues to be a subject broached by younger artists working today. Jalen Gomez created All About My Family in 2014, a work that opens up the question of labor today, which increasingly involves a service economy where workers provide a service like childcare. This work is part of a series in which Gomez reprints at an enlarged scale images from home decor magazines. Right outside on a large estate, the artist has painted a scene of a nanny pushing a stroller, holding two children. Gomez's insertion renders visible the domestic laborers who make possible such scenes of domestic perfection and tranquility. Her interventions pointedly juxtapose the texts in the magazine's imagery and the presence of her inserted domestic workers. Here, the claim all about my family seems impossible without the labor of the nanny. It seems to me one reason why Chicano artists have been excluded from graphic histories stems from a kind of condescension that these artists are all about politics, or even that their work is too local, too community-based. It's important to highlight a critical point, that Chicano artists rose during the global social movements of the 1960s, and so often critically deployed prints and other forms of visual culture, Rupert Garcia's early career demonstrates these global connections. As a student at San Francisco State during the strike of 1968, Garcia recalled what led him and his fellow activists to turn to silkscreen posters. In an interview, he stated, quote, "The impetus was Alf Young from England, the instructor who had been teaching part-time at San Francisco State. He talked about his experiences in Paris in 1968 and what the students were doing there in terms of the rebellion and how they were using silkscreen posters as a way to articulate visually their points of view. So when we heard that, we thought, seemingly in unison, that's what we need to do," end quote. Garcia became a key figure in the Third World Liberation Front, a coalition of Chicano, African American, Asian American, and Native American students who demanded ethnic studies programs at university. Garcia created this poster during the protests. To capture the solidarity among students, he combined the likeness of Che Guevara, a Cuban revolutionary icon who became a symbol of political resistance, with the popular Black power slogan, "Right On." Here, Rodriguez marshals language and symbolic sign systems to emphasize the cross-racial and global solidarity. Chicanx artists responded immediately to unfolding history, and their prints register galvanizing events and public responses. As a young artist, Yolanda Lopez allied herself with Free the People's Seven, a campaign calling for the release of a group of young Latino men arrested for allegedly killing a police officer in San Francisco. Adding to a long list of artworks from the period by artists like David Hammonds that manipulate the American flag in order to highlight the cleavage between the proclaimed and lived values of the United States. Lopez's image turns the stars and stripes of the flag into padlocked prison bars that partially obscure the faces of the 6 men. She surrounds the central image with an adapted quote of the Pledge of Allegiance, which ironically ends with the word "free." This print was paraded at rallies, reproduced in the pages of Basta Ya or Enough, the campaign's newspaper published in collaboration with the Black Panthers. But the Civil Rights era was also a social movement that ushered new ways of being in the world. As we saw in Malaquias Montoya's print, Yo Soy Chicano, to rename yourself Chicano was a bold act of reinvention that asserted an identity grounded in hybrid notions of Mexican, indigenous, and US culture and history. The 1960s were a powerful moment of self-determination as communities celebrated and affirmed the primacy of their hybrid cultural experiences and deeply connected with their indigenous heritage rooted in ancient Mexican cultures. Rejecting the melting pot idea that immigrants and non-white groups should assimilate into American culture, Chicanos asserted the value of Mexican-American life, often emphasized by the Spanish language, by using the Spanish language or Spanglish, as well as their ancestral ties to indigeneity as people from the Americas. Over time, printmaking consistently became a place for artists to project new social worlds and were inclusive and affirmed the experiences of women and LGBTQ communities. This new consciousness opened up unending possibilities for a new future. Magu Luhan features a fantastical landscape on Turtle Island, the native name for North America. He maps out a world free of colonization, with indigenous figures riding Chicano lowriders and speaking through ancient Mesoamerican speech scrolls. The anthropomorphic dog seen in the lower right is a common figure in Magu's art that he employed, in his words, as a quote, metaphor for indigenous Mexican Indian heritage, end quote. Some artists dove into their family memories and cultural traditions to feature unique cultural practices among Chicanos. Carmen Garza depicts her family's familial memories of growing up in South Texas. This scene captures the spiritual cleansing or limpia and other indigenous practices, such as the burning of copal, tree resin, incense. In the background, you see other spiritual references, such as the Virgin of Guadalupe, showcasing the diversity of her family's faith. Claiming indigeneity was of utmost importance to many Chicano artists, and they stood up and stand together in solidarity with quests for indigenous rights across the Americas. Jesus Barraza and Nancy Pilia Hernandez created this print, Indian Land, for a 2004 fundraiser for the Peace and Dignity Journey, an indigenous spiritual run across the continent. They envision an alternative rendering of the Western Hemisphere, erasing national borders and emphasizing the foundational common denominator of the region, indigeneity. Many Chicana artists questioned the passive role of women in Latin American society. Esther Hernandez's iconic print, La Virgen de Guadalupe, Defendiendo los Derechos de los Chicanos, reimagines Mexico's patron virgin as a modern karate-kicking woman breaking out of her sunburst. Hernandez's print rejects the Virgin's usual placid pose and, equally significant, functions as a self-portrait. Hernandez was one of the earliest Chicana artists in the mid-1970s to create works that questioned the marginalization of women in both society in general and within the Chicano movement itself. The largest section of the exhibition, Reimagining National and Global Histories, considers how artists visualized American and global histories based on the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, whose experiences were rarely taught in schools and universities. Revealing the lengthy presence in the United States, revealing the lengthy Chicano presence in the United States required visualizing new historical narratives. The artists in this section critically reflect on pivotal moments in American history. Chicano artists and their collaborators saw themselves as a global movement that challenged injustice. Starting with the Cuban Revolution and the Vietnam War, artists interrogated world events and expressed solidarity with other aggrieved groups. To make their revisionist histories accessible to a wide public, artists sold prints at affordable prices, exhibited their works at alternative art centers they founded, and adopted the bold graphic style of post-revolutionary Cuban posters, as seen here. From the inception of the civil rights movement, Chicano activists, thinkers, and artists challenged dominant structures of knowledge, definitions, categories, geographies, historical frameworks that obscured, marginalized, and distorted history. Artists especially turned to charged moments of US and international current events that history that implicate or ignore Chicano lives and other aggrieved groups with whom they stand in solidarity. Yolanda Lopez, Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim, was created as part of an ongoing campaign initiated when President Jimmy Carter unveiled his controversial 4-point immigration program, which included efforts to limit amnesty for undocumented immigrants already in the country. The figure in the poster assumes the Uncle Sam, I want you posture and turns the male figure into a Native American who points angrily at the viewer while clutching a crumpled document inscribed immigration plans. The title of Lopez's poster draws us back to the colonial period, when Europeans settled in North America without the consent of the region's original inhabitants. Lopez challenges accepted history and positions Europeans as illegitimate border crossers. Rupert Garcia's Obama from Douglas tackles more recent history. Using the artist's trademark triptych format, he invites viewers to ponder the relationship between images. This work features Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist, and Barack Obama, the 44th president of the United States. Between them, a panel of abstracted, animated lines suggests the tumultuous and momentous history that separates and connects these two Black leaders in US history. It was very early during my research for this exhibition that I noticed the prevalence of portraiture in the work of Chicano printmakers, not a genre usually associated with works on paper. Rupert Garcia is a pivotal artist in this regard. And here I'm showing his 1975 portrait of Frida Kahlo, which is one of the first images of the revered Mexican artist by a Chicano artist. In fact, the important scholar and curator Lucy Lepard called Garcia's work in this genre, quote, ideological portraits. Lepard notes, quote, these are images intended to bring injustice and radical life change to life, and to bring the faces of history's third world protagonists up on screens of the dominant culture. At their best, the ideological portraits are icons, even monuments, to the accomplishments and sometimes sufferings of those portrayed, as well as visual homage to their intellectual and social courage, end quote. At SAM, we highlighted portraiture in a dedicated section titled Changemakers, using a salon style, focusing on portraits of people who altered the course of history. In the hands of Chicanx artists, portraiture, a category commonly associated with wealth and privilege, becomes a pedagogical medium that shifts attention from personal aggrandizement and vanity to activism, sacrifice, and social memorialization. We group portraits of activists and artist scholars, including revolutionary leaders like José Martí, who fought against Spanish colonialism in the Americas in the 19th century, the radical Puerto Rican nationalist Lolita Lebrón, the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said, known for his key role in developing the field of post-colonial studies, and activists who fought for civil and human rights of Black people like Dr. Martin Luther King and Angela Davis. The second wall portrays influential artists like Frida Kahlo and Tejana singer Selena, and labor activists and leaders inside and out of the Chicano community, including Joe Hill, Dolores Huerta, and Emma Tenayuca. One of the most elaborate works in the exhibition that uses portraiture is Sandra Fernandez's Mourning and Dreaming High, Con Mucha Fe, created between 2014 and 2018, when public discussions about dreamers and their fate were at a high point. This is one instance that the historical identities of the sitters is not emphasized, and instead the artist works through various printmaking processes to render her sitters less clear and obscured. She prints their likenesses on the aged pages of an 18th century English law book documenting cases of treason, high crimes, and misdemeanors, an implied reference to how dreamers and other undocumented people are criminalized in today's public sphere. The intensely worked prints include bits of paper, milagros, small metal objects in the form of saints and other symbols that are believed to impart protection in times of need, and the artist's own stitching to emphasize the humanity and vulnerability of her anonymous sitters. By installing the prints in the shape of a 13th century Jerusalem cross, the artist presents dreamers as the new crusaders, and she conjures several temporalities at once, encouraging viewers to consider how the future will judge our collective actions or inaction. Even before the unjust murder of George Floyd and the worldwide protests that ensued, our exhibition planned to feature works that address police brutality and the ways in which artists use portraiture to make the individual and communal toll of this struggle more visible. One of the most emotive and difficult prints in the exhibition is this work by Amado Peña that tells a tragic story of the killing of Santos Rodriguez in 1973, a 12-year-old boy who was killed by a police officer who tried to coerce a confession from him and his brother using Russian roulette. Peña's memorial print honors the boy and other victims of police brutality whose names appear beneath Rodriguez's bloodied face. Peña likely based this print on his school portrait of Santos, which is seen here. One of the exhibition's major installations dealt directly with police brutality. The Bay Area artist Ori Original began his Justice for Our Lives series in 2014 in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement as a way to remember and mourn people killed by the police and other forms of police brutality. The project started with the portrait of Oscar Grant, the young Black man who was killed in 2009 by a BART police officer in Oakland. Sadly, Original has created 100 portraits, some familiar names that many of us recognize from the news, and others who might be more recognized within certain regions or communities, like these two portraits of children who died while in custody in the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. To create his likenesses, the artist often reaches out to the victims' families to request a photograph, and from these, he creates simple black and white digital portraits, which he prints and wheat pastes, sometimes in elaborate, colorful arrangements on urban surfaces throughout the Bay Area. His portraits, which portray people full of life, capture the personal style and individuality of his now deceased subjects. He also makes his portraits available for download on his website and encourages users to circulate them on social media and print them for use in protests and urban interventions. This project, which the artist started, continued to expand until the end of 2020. With this project, which the artist continued to expand until the end of 2020, he added portraits devoted to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among others, speaks to the long history of solidarity movements between marginalized groups in the Bay Area. Original portrays Black, Asian, Latinx, Native, disabled, transgender, migrant people, highlighting how police brutality especially affects politically and economically marginalized people. These latter portraits go beyond major historical leaders to capture likenesses of everyday people who have left their mark on the world, often through tragedy. We had acquired the close to the full project when George Floyd was murdered, and Ori jumped into action and created a print that circulated in protests following his death. We later acquired that print too, and it's part of the exhibition and is part of the collection. And this is a great entry point into one of the most exciting and unconventional aspects of our exhibition. The exhibition not only affirms how the graphic movement among Chicano artists continues, it also shows how their experimentation and embrace of new media is taking graphics in new directions. Several artists continue to expand on the concept of graphics beyond the confines of the paper form, embracing time-based media, installations, shareable graphics, exchanged and reproduced across social platforms. Through public interventions and digital methods, artists have thrust graphics into innovative conduits of exchange, using new technologies and digital printing, the internet, social media, augmented reality. Artists today call for a fluid interpretation of graphics that allows them to infiltrate broader public and private spaces. I saw this manifestation unfold as I worked on the exhibition, and images started circulating across my own social media feed. In 2018, high school senior Emma Gonzalez survived the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Several days later, she gave an impassioned speech on live television advocating for stronger gun control. Lalo Alcaraz digitally illustrated Gonzalez's portrait after watching her televised address. He then posted it to his social media channels, asking people to distribute it online or download a high-resolution file from the website for personal printing. The image features "We Call BS," a line from Gonzalez's speech. In the lower register, hashtags add social media-centered trending tags used to lobby for solidarity and gun reform. One of the most exciting works in the exhibition is an installation by Michael Menchaca, who creates environments for his prints. Informed by his deep knowledge of cartoons, Japanese video games, indigenous art forms like Mesoamerican codices, Menchaca creates environments that draw us in, and from there, we're asked to confront difficult contemporary histories, from migration to the power of technology today. These featured prints reflect Menchaca's interpretation of themes ranging from Spanish colonialism to Latinx migration and its relationship to Mexican drug cartels. For this installation, he places the designs of an animated ancient maize corn design, along with science fiction soundscapes to explore the impact of technology on human behavior. In closing, I also want to leave you with a reflection that may not be entirely evident. Printing the Revolution puts forth a noteworthy model for museum practice that is both traditional and new. All of the works in Printing the Revolution are drawn from Sam's permanent collection, and a significant portion were gifted to the museum by the donors you see on this screen. That's the traditional part. Museums like Sam and the National Gallery have been built in part through the donation of collections of works of art. This is one reason why many museums consider themselves collections of collections. At my institution, we constantly talk about the Mellon collection, the Crest collection, the Rosenwald collection, and so on and so forth. But the collectors and donors that gave Chicano prints to Sam were of a different mold, and their motivations for giving were an effort to transform our cultural institutions. Tomás Fausto, seen on the far left, was the first to donate his collection of Chicano prints to Sam. In 1995, he donated his collection of 60 civil rights era prints to the museum. Fausto is a legend in the field of Chicano and Latinx art. His curatorial projects and writings laid the foundations of the field. Over the course of his life and work, he safeguarded a major collection of graphics, which were gifted to him entirely by artists. His collection grew out of his intellectual activism to value, document, interpret Chicano art, and his donation was a form of activism in and of itself, since he was keenly aware that his gift both affirmed Chicano art as American art and could inspire future projects that critically explore the changing dimensions of U.S. identity, history, culture through the arts. And Ibarra Fausto was not alone. The other major donors that generously gifted prints to Sam over the past few years, including Gilberto Cárdenas and Dolores Garcia, Ricardo and Harriet Romo, and the estate of Margie Teresa Santos, exemplify a new kind of museum donor whose contributions bring Latinx perspectives into the museum and that effectively expand how we understand our national culture. Like Ibarra Fausto, these donors came of age during the civil rights movement, became educators, and devoted their lives to public service and Latino cultural advocacy. We view them as activist collectors and donors, and their personal stories of emerging within a civil rights context informs their collecting and their philanthropy. To make museums more representative of the audiences we strive to serve, museums today must expand in all directions, their collections, their exhibitions, their audiences, and donors to truly reflect our country, its history, and our art history. Thank you. Thank you. I would love to entertain questions if you all have any.
Any questions? Please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over. Oh, one here. How did you decide where to do these exhibitions?
You mean the tour?
The tour,
The
yes.
tour. It's a process. We at the Smithsonian American Art Museum has a very strong exhibition traveling program, and it's one of the reasons why this exhibition was also drawn from the permanent collection, because when we share things from our permanent collection, we have more flexibility in sharing things with many institutions. And we have, established relationships with many museums, and we send out information and we get back all sorts of interests. And it's fascinating to see which institutions and which communities want the show. And it's usually institutions who are trying to reach Latinx audiences, institutions that are in cities whose population is transforming, or museums that have collections of American art that want to expand the way that field is conceived, so but it is a part of, we also get interest from the museums themselves. Mm-hmm.
As you've switched to the National Gallery, have you seen a change in the amount of Latinx artworks you're seeing and being able to deal with, since they may not have the collection that you dealt with at the Smithsonian?
Yes. When I joined the National Gallery, I joined the National Gallery at a transformative moment. The museum named Kaywin Feldman as their first female director 5 years ago, and she really embraced a redefinition of the museum, emphasizing public service, and really emphasizing the goal and really the vision that we should reflect and attract the nation. And part of that really permeates everything that we do, from the exhibitions that we present to our collections, to the way that we install our galleries. And we've been building out our curatorial staff to bring in new expertise so that we can build a collection that does reflect, who we are as a nation, since we are the National Gallery. So one of the first hires after Kaywin came on board was a curator of African American and Afro diasporic art, Kenitra Fletcher. And that was a little bit before I joined. So that was in 2021. And we've just appointed a curator of Latinx art, Natalia Vieira, and she's starting literally in a few days. So we are expanding our staff, bringing in new knowledge. And obviously I bring my own knowledge of Latinx art. So even over the past 3 years that I've been at the museum, we've been acquiring work by Latinx artists. Michael knows we recently acquired some of his work, a different body of work than the work that was part of this exhibition. So yeah, there is a big effort at the National Gallery to expand our collections through the lens of excellence, and bringing in really significant works. And of course, the charge at the National Gallery is very different than the charge of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, because our collections are much broader than American art. We have European collections, we have global collections. So Latinx art at the National Gallery is situated in like a different frame. It's a different framework, even though of course we have American collections, and it's part of that history as well.
Can I ask the artist a question? Okay. Why did you choose printmaking as a medium in terms of expressing your art in just commercially? Assume this is your livelihood.
Thank you for the question. For practical reasons, I started as a graphic designer in even before I went to undergraduate in San Antonio College. I learned how to make graphic designs, and I always had an interest to make fine art. And the easiest translation of those digital graphics was through screen printing. So translating like graphic, bold imagery into what I wanted to do was like to make show posters, very much like what you probably have around here on Broadway Street, and like there's Hatch down the street, like that kind of like iconography I wanted to make. But then I didn't realize that I would go through cultural transformations through higher education, where I had to focus in on my identity as a Latino and Latinx. And so that became the subject matter for that process of translating digital graphics to screen prints. And then those are the works that made it into this exhibition. And those are, from 2010, 2011. And so since then, I've continued to build off of that trajectory using video stuff as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions? Oh.
So you kind of mentioned like connections to Mexican modernism in the beginning, especially with framing part of the exhibition as like a new Chicano world. I see, I guess, parallels between that and earlier modernism. So I was just wondering if you had any other thoughts while putting together the exhibition between that connection and that connection to earlier artists, I guess kind of with a new, I don't know if diaspora is the word, but history kind of repeating itself with the Chicano movement in a more modern time.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea of revolution, right? And this exhibition is not about, armed revolution, right? It's a revolution in consciousness. It's, a revolution in the way we understand who communities are, who we are. So I think that kind of change, of creating newness, of breaking with the past, is really at the foundation of this exhibition and the works in this exhibition, and of course relate to other global movements. You might say the same thing with the Mexican Renaissance, and the desire to sort of break with the past, and the way that Mexican culture was viewed, and kind of creating this shift to thinking of Mexican culture through the lens of indigeneity, for example. So definitely there are a lot of parallels, and the artists were very aware of that past. They're artists, right? And even organizers like Cesar Chavez was very aware of those connections. As I mentioned, he was very knowledgeable about art historical movements, politicized art historical movements, like Mexican muralism and the print renaissance that also was alive in Mexico in the first half of the 20th century. So there are indeed, yeah, many connections.
Take one more here.
Hi, Carmen. I have a question on AI, and if you have a policy, either personally or at the National Gallery, either to integrate it or reject it, from a curatorial standpoint, and if AI artists are considered legitimate artists, or is that a legitimate art practice, or what are your thoughts overall involving AI in the arts?
Yeah, we have a very talented head of technology at the National Gallery. And he has been kind of leading a discussion around AI, and what our stance is, is going to be. So we're developing policies about, when to use it, so kind of in a practical way, even in the context of like a workplace way, like what work can AI do? What work can it do? Who could use it, and how do we credit it, or how do we claim that this was done by AI, or share that this was whatever was done by AI. So we're just beginning to have those kind of conversations. And it's mostly focused in this kind of workplace sort of way. So one thing that we're discussing as we're rebuilding our website right now, and we're trying to be more accessible, right? This is a goal of many institutions. For people who are, who are visually impaired. So we're spending a lot of time writing visual descriptions of things, and we're still doing it manually, pretty much. So there's a whole discussion about maybe we're trying to train AI to help us do that. So it's a kind of, that's a good thing. It's a kind of practical thing to help us get more of them up, on our website and share that information. But we also have strict policies to not use any images that were created by AI. As an art museum, we're not promoting images that were created through artificial intelligence, and we're really using it as a tool for our work, and even then a very controlled tool, right? So that our information is not made public, so it's within within a universe of within a space that's controlled. So don't know if that answered your question.
Well, thank you so much,
Okay.
Dr. Ramos. Thank you
Well,
all for
thank you.
coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I believe our galleries are open just for a little bit longer. If you haven't seen the exhibition, please be sure to visit or come back soon to see the wonderful Printing the Revolution.